Hi everyone and welcome back to The Narrative Engineer. I'm your host, Olivier. Last episode we looked at how long-form conversational media can open up internal communication and build real relationships with the people who matter most to an institution. If you missed it, episode 5 is up on our website and wherever you listen to podcasts. Today I want to look at something a lot of communications team run into but rarely talk about directly. How trust actually factors into who wins a proposal, a grant, or a major contract. Here's a pattern I've noticed working in this space, and one that shows up in the research too. When a donor, a federal agency, or a foundation puts out a request for proposals, most organizations pour their energy into the technical side. Logic models, budgets, compliance checklists, and so forth. That work matters. That's obvious, and it's usually very well done. But the narrative section, the part that explains why this organization, specifically, should be trusted with this work, often gets treated as an afterthought. It's handed off late, built from recycled language, and written to satisfy a checkbox rather than to make a case. I don't think it's a communications failure so much as a sequencing problem. Although format submission compliance gets you into consideration, it doesn't usually get you chosen when several organizations meet the same bar. What tends to separate finalists at that point is harder to quantify. How clearly the organization can explain its own value, and how much the reader trusts what they're reading. That's what I want to dig into today. Not a formula, but a way of thinking about trust as something you build deliberately into how you communicate, rather than something that happens by default if the technical work is strong. One thing that I've seen repeatedly, and there's real research behind it, is that dense, jargon-heavy language can actually undercut how credible a piece of writing seems, even if the underlying work is excellent. We've talked about that in previous episodes. A study published in the journal Cognition found that adding unnecessary complexity to an explanation reduced how intelligent and credible readers judge the writer to be, regardless of the quality of the idea itself. That's a useful thing to sit with because it runs counter to the instinct many technical teams have, which is the assumption that more precise, more specialized language signals greater expertise. Sometimes it does the opposite. It makes a reviewer work harder to find the actual substance, and that friction can quietly cost you. A proposal evaluator reading dozens of submissions isn't looking to be impressed by vocabulary. They're looking for a clear, confident answer to why you and why not the other 3 organizations who can also do this work. When that answer is buried in admin and technical language, it's easy for a stronger technical program to read as interchangeable with a weaker one. So the first shift is a simple one. Treat the narrative section as an argument to be made clearly, not a formality to just get through. The second pattern is about how organizations tend to categorize communications and branding work internally, often as a support function, something that gets trimmed first when budgets tighten. There's research that speaks to why that framing can be costly. A 2025 study in nonprofit management and leadership found that when nonprofits lean into a commercialized framing without sufficient transparency, public trust and donation intent measurably decline. The same research found that transparency and a strong existing reputation can soften that effect. Separately, research on nonprofit brand equity has found that the extent to which an audience recognizes and trusts a brand is linked to their actual giving and engagement decisions, not just their awareness of the organization. Taken together, that suggests communications and brand consistency aren't decoration sitting atop the real work. They're part of how an institution earns and keeps the trust of people funding it. If your public-facing presence feels fragmented or inconsistent, that's not just a cosmetic issue. It's a credibility signal, whether or not it's meant to be. I'd position this less as spend more on marketing and more as know that your narrative consistency is one of the things being evaluated, even when it's not written down as a line item. The third piece is about how you actually demonstrate this to a prospective client or partner rather than just asserting it. In our own work, instead of leading with a portfolio of past projects, we try to start by looking directly at a prospective client's current public presence, their website, their reports, how their leadership shows up publicly, and walk through it with them. Not as a universal scoring system, but as a structured way of naming specific things, where the language is hard to follow, where the visual presentation feels inconsistent across platforms, and where leadership is largely absent from the public conversation. That's a framework we've built for our own processes, not an industry standard instrument, but it tends to shift the conversation in a useful manner. Instead of asking a client to trust a general reputation, you're pointing at something specific and asking, does this match how you want to be seen? That's usually a more productive starting point than a generic pitch. The last piece is about what you actually hand someone at the end of this kind of engagement. When a communications or positioning recommendation requires budget approval, well, it often has to be escalated to a director, a board, or an investor who wasn't part of the original conversation. If what you're handing over is a loose set of creative suggestions, it's hard for someone else to defend in a budget meeting. So it's worth thinking about your deliverables the way you'd think about any other internal business case. Clear enough that someone who wasn't in the room can understand the reasoning, and structured enough to connect the communications recommendation to something the organization already cares about: risk, funding, or reputation. None of this is about chasing a trend or performing authenticity for its own sake. It's about recognizing that in a competitive field where many organizations can meet the same technical bar, the way you communicate does more work than most teams give it credit for. The next time your organization puts together a proposal, look at how much time went into the technical sections versus the sections explaining who you are and why you're trusted. If the ratio feels off, it's probably worth having an internal conversation before your next deadline, not after. So that's it for this episode. If this resonated, I would love to hear how this shows up in your own work. Feel free to reach out directly. And until next time, take care and thanks for watching.